Hello, this is Cody Havard, and I'm going to talk to you about a very important project I worked on with Frederick Grieve and Ted Peets. The title of the project is Introduction of a Hierarchy of Outgroup Behavior, and this will be published in the book Rivalry and Group Behavior Among Consumers and Brands, Comparisons in and Out of the Sport Context. What we did with this project is, if you've heard me speak or watched any of the videos recently, you know for a few years now, we've been comparing the way people view their rival groups and their likely behaviors toward their rival groups or an outgroup in the sports setting and a non-sports setting. This project, we brought all of those comparisons together that we have made so far, we have more coming, to try and develop a way to compare outgroup behavior or outgroup derogation amongst different settings. And so in particular, we took the 9 different settings from 8 studies that we have done, and we were able to compare those and introduce a hierarchy of outgroup behavior along with a spectrum of outgroup derogation. So what we know so far is that social identity influences the way that we view ourselves and the way that we view others. One way that influences us is it impacts or influences the groups that we choose. We choose groups that have characteristics that we either feel embody us, or we embody those characteristics, or characteristics that we desire to have and to show other people. Now, when we choose groups, that group identity can often be a very powerful influencer on us and on our behavior and on the way we view in-group members and out-group members. Look in any setting, sports setting, politics, any different setting, where when something happens to our in-group that's positive, we like to stereotype that behavior toward our entire in-group. On the other hand, when something negative happens to an out-group, we also like to try to stereotype that behavior to the out-group. That brings us into this idea of in-group bias, showing bias toward our group and the people in our group, and out-group derogation, which we use to try and compare favorably against an outgroup. And so again, a lot of times we will show bias toward our group in order to fulfill that human need of comparing favorably to someone else. In this instance, we can compare favorably to an outgroup or a rival group. So the issue at hand is that rivalry forms when competitors elevate each other in perceived importance, and they view each other as a threat. And this usually occurs vicariously. If we're looking at the sports setting, most of us are not performing on the field or court or ice where the competitions are taking place. We are vicariously comparing ourselves to supporters of a competing team or a rival team. Now, rivalry can increase consumption, but it can also increase or influence derogation of an outgroup. It can influence our likelihood to celebrate failure by an outgroup, either in direct competition or indirect competition, where our favorite group or our in-group is not involved. It can lead to a win at all costs mentality, which means it can influence people to consider unethical decisions in order to best a rival or competing outgroup. And then also it can influence our likelihood to consider anonymous aggression against others from outside of our in-group, especially if they are a rival group. So what we did in this particular study is we compared the perceptions and likely behaviors people reported toward relevant outgroups in these different settings. As I mentioned at the beginning, we've conducted 8 studies so far where we've compared these perceptions and likely behaviors in the sports setting with a non-sport setting. So right here, we've brought all 9 of those settings together. So we have sport, politics, online gaming, which in particular means people who participate in online gaming using a PC or using a console such as Xbox or PlayStation. We also looked at streaming services such as Netflix, Disney Plus, Prime Video, gaming consoles specific to people who play using either an Xbox or a PlayStation. We also looked at Apple and Samsung mobile phones, Star Wars and Star Trek fandom in science fiction genre, Marvel and DC in the comic genre, and then finally, Disney fans and their perceptions of the Disney parks and the Universal parks. Our main goal of this was to try and compare these groups and identify a hierarchy and spectrum of outgroup derogation that can be used by future researchers and practitioners who are working in these types of settings. So how did we do this? First, we had to develop a composite, and we developed the Group Behavior Composite. And that's made of the 5 different scales and 16 items that make up the rivalry perception scales and the glory out of reflective failure scale. So in particular, within the rivalry perception scale, we have the outgroup indirect competition or outgroup support subscale, which means or reports the likelihood of someone supporting an outgroup and indirect competition where our in-group is not directly involved. It also has the outgroup behavior subscale. So that reports the way someone views the behavior of outgroup members. The outgroup prestige subscale, so the prestige of an outgroup, whether that's in the sports setting or non-sports setting, or within the sports setting, whether it's collegiate or a professional team. And then the sense of satisfaction subscale is the last within the rivalry perception scale. And that measures the enjoyment people get from defeating or favorably comparing to an outgroup in direct competition. So example of this would be in the sports setting, if your favorite team beats a rival team. Outside of the sports setting, if you are a fan of a certain political candidate, this would be, or party, this would be your party being successful against the other party in direct competition. The same can be said for if you are a fan of Apple mobile phones, your or Apple products being favorably compared to Samsung products. The final scale and items that were included in the group behavior composite is the glory out of reflective failure items. And that reports the satisfaction people get from watching the indirect failure of an outgroup. And again, we do this because it allows us to favorably compare our in-group to a relevant outgroup or rival group. And so having these 5 different scales and 16 items together to form the group behavior composite also meant that all scales needed to be worded or scored in a way that they could be consistent. In particular, typically when we collect data, the outgroup indirect competition or the outgroup support subscale is worded differently than all other subscales. It's worded in a way that higher scores mean more positivity toward an outgroup, whereas all the other subscales in the rivalry perception scale and the glory out of reflective failure scale, a higher score indicates more negativity. So what we did is we needed to reverse code the outgroup indirect competition or outgroup support items so that it would be consistent with the other scales. Once we did that, then we were able to come up with an aggregate for each participant response. So that is incorporating all 16 items into one aggregate. We call this a composite because it's a composite score of 5 different measures. So when we were able to do that, then we were able to come up with means and standard deviations for the GBC for participants in each group. When we compared the groups using a Mancova, this is the comparisons that we came up with. And as you can see in this table, if you're reading from your left to right, online gaming was the setting that participants displayed the most or the greatest, strongest negativity toward their relevant outgroup. Whereas comics over on the right side was the setting where people displayed the least negative or even positive perceptions of their outgroup. And we'll get to that in just a second. But as you can see, if you look down the table, you can see the means and standard deviations for each of the scales that we used. And you can also see which other settings they significantly differed from. So for example, online gaming differed from all other settings, and they were more negative than all other settings. If you look at politics, they were more negative than all other settings, except for streaming, which there wasn't a significant difference, and they were less negative than the online gaming setting. Similarly, we go down and you look at sport, it was less negative than online gaming, less negative than politics, but it was more negative than the mobile phones, Disney parks, science fiction, or comic settings. And as you go over to the right, you'll see more of these settings are reported less negativity than the previous ones that came before them. Now, the next step was developing and identifying a hierarchy that could be used by future researchers and practitioners. So this hierarchy of outgroup derogation, or HOD, what we did here is we looked at we tried to separate the settings into different categories. And what you see is highly negative, medium or highly negative, medium negative, or low negative. And how we developed, or how we dissected and split these settings into different categories, was if you look at the highly negative category, you see online gaming, politics, and sport were, if you refer to the previous table, they were more negative than almost every other setting. So those three fell into that highly negative setting. Now, mobile phone actually fell into its own category and formed its own category, the medium highly negative category, because it was less negative than the online gaming, politics, and sport, or online gaming and sport, I should say, but it was more negative than the ones that followed them. So then we take a step down to the medium negative, and this is where we have streaming services and the gaming console settings. So people in these settings reported less negativity toward their relevant outgroup than people did in the highly negative group or the medium highly negative group, but typically more negativity than, or higher mean scores than, the low negativity group. And then finally, we go down to the low negativity group, where we see fans of Disney parks, fans of science fiction, fans of comics, that group being more to the positive side of the way that they view their relevant outgroups. The next thing we did was we wanted to provide a spectrum for future researchers and practitioners working in this area. So we present the outgroup derogation spectrum, or the ODS. Now, if you look at this, you can see that the spectrum would actually run from 1, which would be least negative, to 7, which would be most negative. For purposes of this particular project and presentation, we zeroed in on the spectrum from 3.5 to 5. So the way that you read this one, 3.5 means it's more positive perceptions of the relevant outgroup. And that's where you see comics and science fiction, and I would even say Disney parks, and to some extent online console gaming, that comics and science fiction are below that 4.0 level. So that means fans in those groups, or participants in those groups, actually have more of a positive perception of their relevant outgroup than do groups as we go to the right on this, to your right on this spectrum. So you also see, as we get up to past the neutral point, we have streaming on there with a mean of 4.10, mobile phones with a mean of 4.23, sport with a mean of 4.47. So those are all within that neutral to negative group, that 4.0 to 4.5 group. So they still have somewhat negative perceptions of their relevant outgroups. And then you can see there's a pretty big gap when we get to politics, which has a mean of 4.75, and online electronic gaming, which has a mean of 4.78. Those participants fell into the more negative group, which indicates that those participants have a more negative or strongly negative views and perceptions and likely behaviors toward their relevant outgroups. So what does all this mean? What's the importance and future paths? Well, future paths, we are going to continue comparing outgroup behavior in different settings, and that includes different consumer goods settings, religion, any group setting where people have strong preferences, and any place that people use groups to split or use that social identity to split people into groups. We place ourselves into groups, we place others in outgroups so that we can compare and we can make sense of our surroundings and of our world. Now, the importance of this and the takeaway from this is that we need to start looking for commonalities between groups. What we talked about so far is where there are significant differences in the way that people view their relevant outgroups. And we've seen that with settings such as online gaming, politics, and sport, they tend to be more negative than several of the other settings that were studied in this comparison. However, if we can look for commonalities, then we can possibly look at the common in-group phenomenon. And the common in-group basically means if two people have some type of group that they have in common, a shared interest, then perhaps that is a link for those two people to start understanding each other more, start behaving toward each other a little bit better, and potentially try and at least be able to coexist with one another. For example, if you have two people who are adamantly or diametrically opposed in their political views, but they both are fans of comic books, or they're both fans of Disney parks, then at least those two settings, comics and Disney parks, is one setting or two settings where those people can agree. And maybe then, even though those two people over here are diametrically opposed politically, over here in this group setting, they're not as close or not as far apart. They're a little bit closer together. So they have that commonality. And maybe in the future, you can start to build off of those commonalities, and you can start to have different types of conversations. And there's a little more understanding rather than over here where we have camp one and camp A, and we can't kind of agree to disagree the way that things are going in our society, especially with the rise of social media. Then finally, what we need to do in the future is we want to test this phenomenon of common in-group on perceptions and behaviors. So taking these settings and comparing the way that if somebody is a fan of one of these settings, how does that impact the way they view someone, as opposed to if they are a fan of one setting or multiple settings. We've done this in the sports, using the sports setting, and we found that when people belong to two groups, so they're a fan of sport and politics, or they're a fan of sport and gaming, sport and comics, they tend to be more positive toward their relevant outgroup in both of those groups. And that comes from a place that if we only have interest in one thing or membership in one group, our identity is tied up in that group. If that group experiences some type of failure, that failure hits our identity stronger than if we have multiple interests. And when that our identity is hit that strongly, we're more likely to lash out at someone else or derogate an outgroup. Whereas if we have interest in multiple groups, we our data suggests in most situations, you're less likely to participate in that type of behavior and participate in the report those types of perceptions. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this was informative. I hope it is a conversation starter, or at least something that has people to start thinking about these different settings, and the most important thing, how to find those commonalities between people. We live in a society now where there is so much that is separating people into different groups. And within that separation, there's so much more negativity toward our relevant outgroups. Now, we need to get to a place where we can find commonalities. So maybe if we don't agree on one area, there's all these other areas where we have those commonalities and we have agreement. Thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.